President Trump just promised $2,000 checks to nearly every American. He says they'll be funded by tariff revenue, not taxes, not borrowing, and that the U.S. will even start paying down its $38 trillion debt. If that sounds too good to be true, you're not alone. Because when you dig into the math, the politics, and, the timing, this announcement says far more about where America's economy is heading than about any real stimulus check. Trump's post on November 9th was crystal clear. Not "we might," not "we could." He said a dividend of at least $2,000 a person, not including high-income people, will be paid to everyone. That's not vague language, that's a promise. And it's very different from his earlier Doge dividend idea, where he floated giving 20% of Doge savings back to Americans. Back then, it was under consideration. This time, it's definitive. But the key question is, can he actually deliver? Trump says it'll come from tariffs, trillions of dollars pouring into government coffers, enough to send every American $2,000 and start paying down the debt. Let's check the numbers. According to the U.S. Treasury, total tariff revenue in September hit $31.6 billion. That's roughly $380 billion per year if it holds steady. Meanwhile, the U.S. government overspent by $1.78 trillion in 2025. That means even with record tariffs, we're still borrowing 5 times as much as we're collecting from them. So where exactly are these trillions coming from? Well, they aren't. Even if Trump could pull it off, even if $380 billion magically stretched far enough, sending $2,000 checks to nearly every American would flood the system with cash. And history tells us exactly what happens next. Each time Washington has done this, from the pandemic stimulus to the 2008 bailouts, inflation followed. The government says inflation is around 3%. But independent measures suggest it's closer to 6%. And if these checks went out, you could easily see double-digit inflation again, or at least a slow burn that erodes your purchasing power month after month. That's the part few people want to say out loud. Cut a new round of broad checks while the government's running massive deficits, and you guarantee another inflation wave, whether it shows up in the CPI right away or through a slower decline in what your dollars can buy. Now here's where things get tricky. When inflation spikes, so do borrowing costs, unless the Federal Reserve steps in. And that's what they always do. They return to quantitative easing, or QE, printing money to buy treasury bonds and keep rates from exploding. But that only digs the hole deeper, because each time the Fed prints money to control yields, it quietly taxes savers, devalues the dollar, and props up the debt bubble just a little longer. So if Washington adds new recurring outlays like these checks without cutting spending elsewhere, the Fed will have no choice but to intervene again. QE 5.0, if you will. It's a cycle. Spending, inflation, higher yields, Fed intervention, more inflation. Even if the economics weren't impossible, the politics are. For $2,000 checks to happen, Congress has to approve it. 50 votes in the Senate through reconciliation, or 60 under normal procedure. And let's be honest, a handful of fiscal conservatives won't vote for it. They'd argue, correctly, that it's fiscal suicide. So unless the economy truly collapses in 2026, the odds of this passing are slim. The only scenario where it happens is one of desperation, a deep recession that forces Washington to do something. And that's the real story here. Trump's promise isn't about generosity. It's a political signal, a sign that mass stimulus is back on the table. There's one more wrinkle. Trump's tariffs are being challenged in the Supreme Court. If the court strikes them down, even partially, tariff revenue could be cut in half. That would drop annual collections below $200 billion. That's barely enough to fund a month of interest payments on the national debt, let alone pay for universal checks. So, whether you support Trump or not, the math doesn't lie. We're promising prosperity on borrowed money, betting that inflation can be controlled, and ignoring the limits of the system itself. And that's where investors, especially the ones paying attention, should be focused. Because whether it's Trump or Biden, Washington is signaling the same thing. They're willing to print, borrow, and spend whatever it takes to keep the system running. The next wave of inflation may not hit tomorrow, but you know it's coming. And when it does, the Fed will be forced to choose between saving the dollar or saving the debt. That's why we built a Gray Swan investment fraternity. Inside the fraternity, we break down what these announcements really mean for your money and how to position yourself before the headlines hit. Because by the time Washington admits there's a problem, the damage is already done. Join the Gray Swan investment fraternity and get the insights, the strategies, and the early warnings that most investors will never see. Because in this economy, waiting for the check might be the worst investment strategy of all.